On the freezing, pitch-black night of March 11th, 1946, the British intelligence team and a heavily armed squad of soldiers descended on the quiet farmhouse in Gottrupel. They did not come with a polite knock. They did not come with a formal arrest warrant. They came like men closing in on a ghost they had chased across the ruins of Europe. The soldiers kicked in the doors in the dead of night, Sten submachine guns raised, flashlights cutting through the darkness. They dragged the man known as Franz Lang out of a small sleeping niche in the barn and forced him into the cold night air, wearing nothing but his pajamas. Even then, Rudolf Hess did not panic. He was a master of bureaucratic deception. Standing there, shivering under the glare of British flashlights and surrounded by armed soldiers, he held to his cover story with remarkable control. Calmly, he insisted he was nothing more than a simple sailor, a hard-working farmhand, a low-ranking man who knew absolutely nothing about the SS or the concentration camps. He spoke with such composure, such measured confidence, that some of the British soldiers began to wonder if Hedwig had given them a false lead. But Captain Hans Alexander was meticulous. He did not focus on the performance. He focused on the details. And there, in the beam of a flashlight, he noticed one small thing that betrayed the disguise: a gold wedding band glittering on Lang's finger. Alexander stepped forward and ordered the man to remove it. Huss hesitated. He claimed the ring had been on his finger so long that it was stuck, impossible to take off. But Alexander, rapidly losing patience and fully aware of who was likely standing before him, drew his sidearm. Then, in flawless and menacing German, he informed Lang that if he did not remove the ring, immediately the finger would come off with it. Alexander would simply cut it off with his combat knife. At that moment, the game ended. Realizing the lie could go no further, Hess relented. He bit his finger, slicked it with saliva, and painfully slid the gold band over his knuckle. Then he handed it to the British captain. Alexander lifted the ring into the beam of his flashlight and looked closely at the inscription inside. Engraved clearly in the gold were two names, Rudolf and Hedwig. That was it. The mask shattered instantly. The illusion of Franz Lang, the humble farmhand, the quiet sailor, vanished into the freezing dark. In his place stood the commandant of Auschwitz, fully exposed at last. What happened next was rarely detailed in the sanitized language of official British military reports, but the men who were there remembered it clearly. Several soldiers in the arrest party, including Jewish men who had personally seen the apocalyptic horrors of the liberated camps, did not treat Hess with the cold restraint expected of military police. According to historical accounts and later testimonies, Hess was dragged back into the barn for immediate interrogation. Then the rage broke loose. The soldiers used axe handles, heavy military boots, and their fists to unleash the fury of millions of victims. The beating was severe, direct, and unrestrained. It was so violent that the medical officer present had to intervene, and only then did Hans Alexander pull his men away from the bleeding commandant. He did not stop them out of mercy. He did not stop them out of sympathy. He stopped them because Hess was more valuable alive than dead. A dead Nazi was only a corpse. A living commandant could stand before the world. A living commandant could speak at Nuremberg. A living commandant could confess, in his own voice, the scale of the Holocaust to history itself. Before they dragged him to the transport vehicle, the medical officer forced open Huss's mouth and searched it carefully, shining a light down his throat to make sure there was no hidden cyanide capsule concealed inside a false tooth. It was the exact method his superior, Heinrich Himmler, had used to escape justice just 1 year earlier. Only after that search, only after they were sure he could not cheat the noose with poison, was Rudolf Hess secured in British custody. And then something deeply unsettling happened. The defiance vanished. The resistance disappeared. In its place came a chilling transformation. Hess became eerily cooperative, almost robotic. He did not beg for his life. He did not claim insanity. He did not express 1 ounce of remorse for the men, women, and children murdered under his command. Instead, he became the perfect witness to his own crimes. Once safely inside British custody, Rudolf Hess revealed something even more terrifying than defiance. He revealed total emotional emptiness. There was no breakdown, no madness, no visible torment. The man who had overseen industrialized murder simply began to talk. During the Nuremberg trials, and later in his own prison memoirs, Huss described the daily function of mass killing with the tone of a factory manager discussing production targets. He spoke in calm, cold detail about the output of the gas chambers, about the mechanics of extermination, about the comparative efficiency of Zyklon B over carbon monoxide. He spoke as though he were solving a technical problem, as though the murder of human beings had been nothing more than an administrative assignment. That was what made him so horrifying. He was not ranting. He was not incoherent. He was terrifyingly sane. To the British soldiers guarding him, that absence of visible humanity was more chilling than any screaming fanatic could ever have been. They realized they were dealing with a man who had optimized mass murder as a logistical exercise. And then came one of the most ghastly moments of all. When an Allied interrogator suggested that Höss had killed 3 million people at Auschwitz, Höss calmly corrected him. He said the figure was inaccurate. According to his own statement, he had murdered only 2.5 million, while another 500,000 had died of starvation and disease. He delivered that correction with clinical detachment, as if he were amending a ledger entry. Following his testimony at Nuremberg, the British handed Rudolf Höss over to the Supreme National Tribunal of Poland. The decision carried enormous weight. Poland had suffered unimaginably under Nazi occupation, and it was determined that Höss should face justice where his crimes had been committed. He was tried in Warsaw, found guilty of crimes against humanity, and sentenced to death by hanging. Then came the final act of poetic justice. Höss was transported back to Auschwitz for his execution. On April 16, 1947, Rudolf Höss was marched to a specially constructed gallows. It had been built just a few dozen yards from the crematoriums he had once overseen, and within sight of the luxurious villa where his children had played while millions of human beings were reduced to ash next door. That image alone says everything. The man who had hidden on a remote farm near the Danish border, who had milked cows and tended horses under the false name Franz Lang, who had believed the chaos of post-war Europe would bury his past forever, was brought back to the very ground, soaked with the consequences of his decisions. Not to command, not to conceal, not to escape, but to die. And that is why the capture of Rudolf Höss mattered so much. The British soldiers who dragged him from that freezing barn in Gottrupel did not merely arrest a fugitive, they secured the historical record. By unmasking the so-called simple farmhand, they proved something the retreating Nazis desperately wanted to deny. No barn was remote enough. No disguise was clever enough. No alias was strong enough to hide the truth from those determined to drag it into the light. Even in the ruins of Europe, even after the Reich had fallen into fire and dust, the hunt did not end. And for one of the chief engineers of the Holocaust, the road from Auschwitz led not to freedom, but back to Auschwitz itself. The lesson is stark. Evil does not always arrive screaming. Sometimes it arrives with paperwork, schedules, transport lists, and polished efficiency. Sometimes it hides behind ordinary gestures, false names, and the mask of a quiet working man. But truth has a way of surviving. Justice, even delayed, has a way of returning. And history remembers the faces that tried to disappear.